since we follow politics here every day, it's easy to get lost in the weeds of things like impeachment and miss the broader societal trends that are actually going to impact you, impact your kids, impact your life moving forward. One of those big societal trends is the social left's embrace of the idea that gender and sex are completely separate and that your child should be able to pick his or her gender as distinct from his or her sex, that if your daughter believes that she is your son, then you should simply go along with it. And the left wants to cram this perspective down. Writing about this in the latest issue of National Review is Madeleine Kearns. She's a journalist from Glasgow, Scotland, William F. Buckley Fellow in Political Journalism at National Review. She has a great piece in this month's issue called The Tragedy of the Trans Child. Madeleine, thanks so much for joining the Ben Shapiro Show.
Thanks for having me, Ben.
So why don't you start with what prompted this piece in the first place? Obviously, some of us have been watching the rise of the transgender rights movement with a lot of skepticism. They've gained a lot of ground in a very short amount of time. But you write about the fact that this is really hurting children. What prompted the piece?
Sure. So I originally trained as a teacher in Scotland. And as you know, the coverage of this issue in Scotland and in the UK has actually been slightly more dogged. And that's partly because we don't have as much of a culture war. So it's a left-on-left fight, and the liberal left are fighting the radical left on this issue. And so you get it in mainstream news reporting. When I moved to the US, which was about 3 years ago, and especially when I started working for National Review about a year ago, I noticed that nobody was seriously looking into it here. And I thought, well, it must be happening here if it's happening in the UK. And right enough, it's happening here, perhaps even worse.
Well, you talk a lot about in this article what's happened in the UK, the radical increase in the number of kids who are now being identified by parents as transgender. What has prompted this radical increase? I suppose those on the left would say, well, all these kids have just been suppressed and oppressed by society for years on end, but it seems like there's something very different going on.
Sure, and I think this is most obvious when you consider the change in demographic. It used to be acute gender confusion, used to be very rare, and mainly natal boys. And now what you're having is a lot of teenage girls, and with cluster effects. So it would be something like, 5% of a school's population identifying as transgender. And I think the obvious answer to that is social and peer contagion, which Lisa Littman of Brown University wrote a very brave research paper about a year ago, basically outlining that trend. But it's not just affecting this demographic of teenage girls. It's especially affecting very vulnerable children, so children who might have cognitive disabilities or children who might have autism, so very prone to black and white thinking, latch on to the idea of gender ideology, and then clinicians and parents are pushing them down this very dangerous path.
We're speaking with Madeleine Kearns, writer at National Review. One of the things that I was noting earlier on the show, and I've been noting over the past several months, is the move by the medical community to embrace utterly unscientific viewpoints with regard to gender dysphoria. First, there was the reclassification by the American Psychiatric Association's Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. They called it gender identity disorder, and then they termed it gender dysphoria in 2013 based on no additional evidence. They basically just suggested that the standard had changed from you identify as a member of the opposite sex to you identify as a member of the opposite sex, but now you're depressed about it. They sort of added that final term on there to suggest that otherwise, this is a perfectly normal thing to do, to identify as a member of the opposite sex. It's only the depression associated with it that is seriously problematic. You've seen that. Now you've seen the American Medical Association just last week declare that they would like to see a federal ban on what they call conversion therapy, which is not electroshocking kids, God forbid. It's just a doctor talking to them about the fact that they are actually members of their biological sex.
Yeah, this is the serious problem. In my view, this is the scandal, is the fact that the medical establishment, and it really is a very small number of people who are doing this. It's sort of committees. So the American Academy of Pediatrics is a great example. A committee of about 30 people approved a document written by one doctor with no published research in this area. And what's happening is that they're taking their cues from these lobby groups, these advocacy groups, and it's having a knock-on effect. So you mentioned the American Psychiatric Association. The other one, of course, is the World Health Organization. These have been influenced by these lobbyists, these advocates purporting to be pursuing evidence when, of course, they're not. There's then a domino effect when they come out with their statement saying that the only way to treat this is to encourage a child in their false belief that they are the sex they, quote-unquote, identify with. Then everybody else just goes along with it. And what you end up having is these organizations that represent hundreds of thousands of doctors writing policy statements intended for use by hundreds of thousands of doctors who are really being very dangerously misled, as are the parents of these children.
I mean, it's astonishing how skimpy the evidence is that these medical these medical associations are using to push forward this policy. I was noting that over the past several weeks, there's been a lot of attention paid to one specific study in the journal JAMA Psychiatry that was put out by an actual activist named Turner. And the study supposedly suggested that, quote unquote, conversion therapy was increasing suicidality among people who identified as transgender. The problem was that the entire study was an opt-in survey of people who continue to identify as transgender, which is like surveying people who are divorced about whether marital therapy is effective or not. The whole point of so-called conversion therapy, or what we would call normally cognitive behavioral therapy with regard to gender dysphoria, the whole point of that is that you're helping people not identify as the opposite sex. And so if you don't even survey the people who once identified as trans but no longer do, then you're missing the entire control population for purposes of these studies. And then on the basis of that, the AMA has declared that it is now willing to push a full federal banning of any psychiatric treatment or psychological treatment that is rooted in the idea that you should actually try to align people's identity with their biological sex.
Well, what's interesting about that study you mentioned as well is, so Jack Durbin, who was the psychiatrist at Harvard who helped direct it, he came on, he published an op-ed in Psychology Today basically saying, summarizing his study, and when medical professionals posted critiques, their comments were mysteriously deleted. I had doctors email me saying, I think we're being censored for saying that this study is dangerously flawed in its methodology and its conclusions. Jack Durbin has also written an essay for the New England Journal of Medicine, basically saying quite forthrightly that he hasn't got over the fact that he had a homophobic father, and that this is still an issue that he struggles with. So I think that this is somebody who clearly struggles with their own confirmation bias and has even written that in his published work. I mean, it's just astonishing the fact that this is just not in any way scientific, and we're also expected to believe that this is science and base medical decisions for children which are going to have cancer.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I find obviously so troubling about all of this is that it is extending into the world of government. And again, based on data that have not even been really tracked over the course of time. And so you will see people say things like the only treatment that is proved to have worked with this is actual gender change, meaning hormonal treatment, the sterilization of young girls, bodily mutilation in many cases. Now, last I've seen, Madeleine, unless I'm missing it, I haven't seen a lot of longitudinal data suggesting that sex change operations are significantly superior to non-sex change operations in terms of alleviating a lot of the psychological distress that occurs with regard to this sort of stuff.
No, quite on the contrary, which is why that they were stopped in the 1970s at Johns Hopkins under Paul McHugh. But more to the point, there's absolutely no precedent whatsoever for doing this to children. I mean, Ben, children as young as 12 in the United States are going on cross-sex hormones, which are sterilizing. Children as young as 13-year-old girls are having their breasts removed. There's a clinic in Los Angeles. The director of that clinic has said on the record that she's recommended full double mastectomies for about 200 girls under 18. There's boys as young as 15 having vaginoplasty, where they literally peel and invert the penis to form a cavity. I mean, this is stuff that we can scarcely imagine the psychological effect this is going to have when these people realize in later life that they have no sexual function. I mean, it's just unbelievable that this is happening.
So Madeleine Kearns of National Review, why do you think this is happening? Meaning that normally you would suspect that this is out of sympathy for people who have gender dysphoria or gender identity disorder, but the folks who are pushing this completely ignore the about 80% by best estimates of kids who completely grow out of this thing. And they seem to suggest that this is fixed, non-malleable, that as soon as you have gender identity disorder, that's because your brain in some sort of Cartesian duality does not align with your biological sex. You have a mind that is completely separate from your body, which is utterly unscientific. And then your mind is supposedly a different sex, and therefore your mind can't be changed, but your sex can. Where is all of what is the political drive for this, given the fact that the evidence is so scanty?
Well, I think we've always had crazes in psychiatry. Psychiatry's always been vulnerable to crazes. We had that with the satanic ritual abuse and the false memory syndrome, all those things. But this one's different, and the reason it's different, I think, is because it's got this political force behind it, because it's seen as a continuation of the gay rights movement, which is seen as a continuation of the civil rights movement. That's why it's really taken hold in America. But I think there's something even more sort of worrying about it, and that is transhumanist agenda, this idea that we're amidst a gender revolution. This is what some of the clinicians pushing this stuff say. They talk like cult leaders, really. They talk like religious believers in this gender revolution, that we're going to find a way to recreate ourselves, and it's going to be so great and it's so cutting edge. I mean, it's hard not to be reminded of Huxley's Brave New World. I think that is the philosophical drive given political force, because very credulous people, especially in the Democratic Party, see it as just one big LGBT electoral bloc, which we can't possibly question, because that would be political suicide.
One of the things that I am deeply worried about is that the next direction for the social left on this is something like a federal ban, and then the move after that won't just be a ban on psychologists and psychiatrists actually engaging in what they call watchful waiting, which is where they say, okay, well, we're not going to make up your mind for you on this. We're just going to wait. And it's not just going to be a ban on, psychologists and psychiatrists and pastors who say, no, I want to work with you so that your idea of gender identity is in alignment with your biological sex. The next step will be that if you're a parent and you send your kid to school and they go to a public school, and you and your kid tells the teacher that they are a member of the opposite sex, and then tells the teacher that you refuse to acknowledge their new gender identity, that the school will call CPS on you. That the next step will be the actual invasion of private parenting, because the state has decided that you are an unfit parent if you don't believe in all the nostrums of the LGBTQ movement with regard to this particular issue.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, we're already seeing in family courts throughout the United States, and many of them are not reported to the media because there's gag orders, this being fought out quite often between parents who have a different point of view. But you're absolutely right, Ben, that there's a concern here with federal intervention. We see this just now with the Equality Act, which the House passed earlier this summer, and that sets a precedent in one of its findings. It talks about conversion therapy. And then also we have the Supreme Court hearing Harris Funeral Homes, which in relation to Title VII, so a slightly different issue, is looking at potentially redefining sex to include gender identity, which for the purposes of anti-discrimination law, which would bring about all sorts of legal precedent, bringing this as a protected characteristic, which is something that the medical profession until very, very recently would have considered to be a mental disorder. Obviously people with mental disorders need help, but the question is how we help them, not whether.
Well, this whole thing is obviously deeply frightening, and Madeleine Kearns is on top of it. Really appreciate your work, Madeleine. It's a great piece. Go check it out in National Review. Madeleine Kearns of National Review. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you.